Good morning. So glad you all are here this morning. Can you hear me? My name is Lisa Hayes, and I am the Director of Collections here at the Library Society, and I'm so glad to see everybody here this morning. Today we're going to hear from Alysann, Sieren, and Ginny about This Strange Eventful History by Messud. It's going to be really kind of fun, I think. We'll have some time for questions at the end, so we look forward to your participation in that. Please, if you will, take a moment to be sure your phones are on silent. And I wanted to let you know the book for next session of the book club, which will be June 18th, I hope you can come, is going to be The Great Gatsby by Fitzgerald. So it's celebrating 100 years in April of this year. So we thought it'd be fun to choose a classic, and the one that we settled on just happens to also be celebrating 100 years, which is a really nice kind of a tidy thing. So hope you can make it on June 18th. I want to thank everybody who's on our book club for all the work they do to put together these really wonderful book club meetings, and especially today, Alysann and Ginny. So let's welcome them. Thank you.
I'm Ginny Bush, and I know my listeners not very well, so if you cannot hear me, wave maniacally or something. The book that we're discussing today is the ninth novel written by Messud, who's an American author and creative writing professor at Harvard. I understand she spoke at the literary festival. Some of you may have heard her. The novel's title derives from a key soliloquy in Shakespeare's As You Like It. Like the novel, the title and the epigraph examines an individual's passing through various phases of life, 7 phases of life, in fact. The evolution from infanthood to dotage and death. You will see this replicated and paralleled in this book. It's loosely based on Messud's own family history. Her father was Canadian, and her mother was Canadian, and her father was French Algerian. Her maternal grandparents were exiled from Algeria, and her grandfather recorded their experiences in a 1,000-plus page manuscript that he wrote for the benefit of the French. That also is paralleled in this book. It is a work of fiction, but was clearly, did I lose that line? It's a work of fiction, but it's certainly inspired by her own family genealogy and history. In this novel, she chronicles the experiences of the Cassers, a French-Algerian family, Gaston and Lucienne, their children, Francois and Denise, and Francois' wife, Barbara, and their children, Lulu and Chloe. The novel opens in 1940 Algeria, introducing us to Gaston and Lucienne, the patriarch whose mythic, idealized marriage and love sustains them and suffocates their family. They are Pinois. I don't speak French. Pinois. David, is that okay? Pied-Noir. Okay. Thank you. Come on up. You know, French settlers in colonial North Africa. But they're displaced by World War II and the successful fight for Algerian independence in 1962. There's it. Got a couple of film clips.
Veulent débattre de l'après-indépendance, plus d'1 million de pieds noirs sur une population de 9 millions quittent définitivement le pays. La plupart vont découvrir la France pour la première fois. Ils sont originaires pour beaucoup d'Italie, de Malte ou d'Espagne. Des ouvriers, des fermiers attirés par une vie meilleure en Algérie. La France, qui s'empare de l'Algérie en 1830, leur a promis des terres, des emplois, et va leur donner la nationalité française pleine et entière, le droit de vote, ce qui ne sera jamais le cas pour les Algériens. En 1962, les pieds noirs fuient dans la précipitation, un pays où ils vivent parfois depuis plusieurs générations, le plus souvent avec une valise à la main. Partent quelques mois par peur des représailles après 7 années d'une guerre extrêmement violente. Une guerre où ont péri au moins 250 000 Algériens, des combattants du FLN, Front de Libération Nationale, et surtout des civils algériens. 25 000 militaires français et 10 000 pieds noirs. Des mois d'atrocités qui ont mis les deux communautés à feu et à sang. Les exactions de l'armée française d'un côté, de l'autre, les attentats meurtriers des combattants algériens contre les Européens.
Lucienne and Gaston's children are siblings bound by their shared sense of displacement from Algeria. Later, Francois marries Barbara, an outsider, a Canadian, who struggles to understand her husband's complicated heritage and his idealized view of marriage. Finally, there's Chloe, Francois and Barbara's daughter, who believes that excavating buried family stories might finally bring them all peace. Here's a map slide showing the diaspora of this family. A lot of frequent flyer.
True.
But they ratcheted back and forth through most of the continents. And the book is divided into 7 parts, echoing that 7 phases of man. I noticed that the number 7 recurs often in this book. Mythological numerology, I suppose.
Thank you, Ginny. So I'm Alysann Sieren. I was really pleased to partner with Ginny on the study of this book because study is exactly what we had to do. And Ginny read it no less than 2 times and has a very highly annotated copy if anyone would like to borrow it. She's done
Anyone ever seen Jessica?
But I think anyone who examines it closely would agree that you need to do that. As Ginny said, this narrative spans 7 decades with major world events, as well as multiple continents. I think the only continent that where this family did not have a presence is Asia, which is why it's covered up on the slide. But they're uprooted again and again. So we included the table on the side of the slide here to just help follow along with the narrative. You can see not only was the book made more complex with all of the different voices of the narrators, but also the different places where they lived, and then the sequence of time, the chronology on the far right of that table. So they settled in France, Argentina, Australia, Canada, the U.S., but in each place they felt they felt displaced in each location, and they struggled to come to terms with the complexity of their French-Algerian identity as at the time when France's colonial empire collapses. And I'm so glad that you're here because maybe you can tell us more about that. So as Ginny said, the novel is structured in 7 parts. It also has a prologue, an interlude, and an epilogue, which were particularly insightful. And it jumps in time and location, chapter by chapter, starting in Algeria in 1940 and ending in Connecticut in 2010. Throughout the book, the trauma of displacement was a key theme in the narrative, and it echoes throughout the generations of the Cassar family. So as we go from Gaston down to his granddaughter Chloe. The novel also addresses another key theme, and that is the politics of colonial and even post-colonial identity. So wherever the Cassars live, they experience a sense of rootlessness as a result of their exile from Algeria. And they search for belonging in many different ways. And that characterizes both the family as well as this group and culture of the Pied Noirs as a group. I was surprised to learn in the video, how large that displacement was from Northern Africa. So it's only the 3rd generation of the Cassars, Francois and Barbara's 2 daughters, Chloe and Lulu, who can see Algeria for what it was. They felt like it was a country occupied and exploited by settler colonialists, with all due respect to our friend from France. This makes the novel feel relevant, I think, in this era that we're living in now of global migration and a refugee crisis, particularly as we think about Gaza and the Middle East. The author, Messud, pays particular attention to how cultural displacement and rootlessness create identity confusion for this family. And as a result, they have a never-ending search for belonging and home. And that makes it difficult for them to hold on to their family and cultural traditions. Interestingly enough, Messud, if you have done any reading about the author, is known for her narratives, which are really character-driven, particularly having multiple settings and strong female figures, maybe being autobiographical, as we learned with her grandparents' history. And she often explores how identity and relationships evolve and how historical events impact individuals, families, and entire communities. So with that, we cannot wait to discuss this book with you. To find out what your opinions were.
In the prologue, Chloe, who is the only person who speaks in the book in first person, she's the writer, remember, says that her goal in writing is to be a healer and refers to the shame of her family history. Do you think that telling the family history healed anyone? And, there's another follow-on question really is, in your opinion, what was the shame to which she referred?
We'd love to hear your thoughts. And I would say, were there multiple shames to which she referred?
Do you think maybe the shame relates to, this is a spoiler alert, Gaston's and Lucienne's marriage? I see some nods.
Yeah, we have a microphone. If you'll just raise your hands, Christy will pass the microphone. We know you've got opinions, right?
The obvious one to me is that they were ashamed to believe they were French, but they really weren't French. So I think that was a shame for them, their national identity.
I thought there was this sort of foretelling early on that something was going on, the oddity of the 13-year age difference between Francois and Gaston. And at one point there was some little comment that aside that I couldn't connect dots, but ultimately I think one of the functions of the father writing that 1,000-page tome and sort of explaining the family structure, where the husband and wife were actually his aunt. The father figure marries his aunt. And I remember when Barbara, at one point, after this is revealed, apparently says, well, I wouldn't have married you if I had known this, which scientifically has some validity. So I think carrying that shame was a big issue. But it took a while to figure out and connect the dots as a reader.
The entire book.
The entire book.
Yeah. And it's alluded to, which we, on a closer reading, determined, but yeah, it took the entire book.
But it was interesting, though, that didn't come out to the very end. So, yes, it's shame, but Francois and Denise didn't know about it until way down the road, which, so I don't know.
That's a very good point.
We have a slide too. Let's just go to that slide. That might help us all. Little family tree. It is circular, as you see.
Yeah, we did struggle to come up with this rendition of a genealogy. There is a section in the book that sheds light on the genealogy, finally. As you'll see, the characters that were not really addressed in the book were Sposito and Josephine, who gave birth to Marie-Therese, Fee, Jean, and Lucienne. Lucienne married Gaston. At the end of the book, near the end of the book, we find out that Lucienne was Gaston's aunt. For a while, you knew that there was a 13 or 14-year age gap, and that there was something a little secretive and withheld regarding their relationship. So they had children, Francois, Denise, Francois, and his wife Barbara, then had Chloe and Louis. Another possibility for the shame question could be, was it because they were participants in the colonialism that cast the family out of what they regarded as the Garden of Eden, Algeria? They were participants, arguably. Maybe it was the sin of withholding family facts from the children and the grandchildren until the bitter end. Any thoughts on that?
I don't know that I'd call it shame, but Francois was always incredibly bright and a superstar as a young man. And he went charging through all the schools at the top. But he never could find his way properly, no matter what. Even though he got a Fulbright, he went to Amherst. He was unhappy. His father was very powerful and very authoritarian. And so I think he never really could come up to the hopes that his father had for him as a career.
He was sort of a malcontent, wasn't
Yeah.
he? That's where I saw the rootlessness and the lack of belonging. He couldn't find his foothold.
No, he kept studying different subjects. He got a PhD partially written, and then he was sort of pushed into that French company to make money, but, and Barbara was always unhappy with him, and She didn't like the French. She didn't like Paris. It was a doomed relationship.
Right. Let's talk about the colonial piece a little bit further. Interesting as we sit in one of the United States' oldest cities, right? So the Cassar family is said to be on the wrong side of history. And what Ginny and I spent time talking about is, when is it legitimate to feel accountable? Let's soften it from shame. Maybe it's accountable over one's ancestors' colonialist background. So if you consider the generations of Germans, Japanese, or even those of us in this room that may be descended from Southern American families, with the long-standing history of Charleston as a Confederate city, you know, how does that play into our own viewpoint of ourselves?
So, as you're talking about shame, I this woman over here that I don't think about it as shame, because you're certainly not responsible for anything that went on before your birth. And when we talk about history and family history, there are many people that don't know their family history because they're only first, second, or third generation Americans. And then I just kind of chuckle as you read different books that talk about the new DNA. Everybody's getting their DNA, and they find out that they have a sister that lives, in the United States that they never knew existed, or, other family members. So I really just don't think we should be responsible for that. And I think people keep quiet about a lot of it just so that no one around them judges them for that, insight that they've come up with.
Any other thoughts?
It's not off topic, but
I thought it was interesting that they thought of themselves as being French, even though they didn't live in France. I mean, they lived in outpost of France. But then when Francois goes and lives in Paris, he hates it. I mean, I think that, I don't know if the right word is shame for that, but there was definitely a deep uncomfortableness with everywhere he ever went. And I don't know if that comes from the root of having lived in a colony so much as just never being really from anywhere. And where they were from no longer existed. I mean, it does exist, but they couldn't go back there. So, and we have several Cuban friends who left when they were, in their early teens or as children, and I think they feel the same way. I mean, it's just never quite right. It's never Cuba. So, anyway, it's a little bit off topic.
I think it's an interesting point, Susan, because Francois is talking to a Jewish friend at one point. I think it's Francois or Gaston, I can't recall. And you may remember the Jewish friend says, we've been running for thousands of years. We don't have a place, referring to the diaspora. So I think it's very much a key theme of the book, that displacement.
Shame. I don't know if that's the right word.
Let me just address the word shame. We're using the word shame because Chloe used the word shame. We're not necessarily concluding that they do feel shame or should. But Chloe apparently thought there was shame in the family. And I think we're exploring what's the basis for that shame. And I guess we're also asking, should one feel shame? I have a colonialist background. It was several hundred years ago when my family on both sides came from England. And over time they became colonists. Should I feel shame about that?
Right.
Forgive me, but I don't. Molly.
Yeah. I wanted to address that shame issue. I'm not a psychiatrist, others are here, but I know that we often can inherit the shame of our parents without knowing what it is. It just inherit that feeling. And to come back to that, to the question, I do think is potentially helpful to understand where that shame comes from. To me, Francois never occurred. I don't know what he actually ever understood that, but he definitely inherited it without knowing why. Anyone who tried to pin it, this or that and the other thing. But the point is, he inherited it. It was into his DNA. And I do think it is easy to come to understand that.
And let me just read to you from the prologue, which is written in Chloe's voice. She said, "Or I could begin with my birth, or my father's birth, or his father's birth, or my mother's or grandmother's. I could begin with the secrets and shame, the ineffable shame that in telling their story I would wish at last to heal. The shame of the family history, of the history into which we were born." So, and then she says, I could begin, of course, with the aloneness. So it's very nuanced. I'm not sure what she's referring to.
I think the shame is somewhat generational and somewhat contemporary. It's Chloe. She's a person who has in many ways to think about these things in this term. French experience in Algeria, I don't know a lot about it, but is a little different than sort of our notions about France based on the English experience. The French were very much in assimilation. These are Europeans, largely French, backwards and Spanish. They moved in the 1830s, 40s, throughout the 19th century. They were very successful. The only thing, my own experience was they were very proud of their experience. They really thought they had made it. And the French government set Algeria up as a department, a state, in the same sense that, Bordeaux is a state representing Parliament, the whole deal. So they're portrayed in their minds. This is, instead they just sort of shipped it back to France. They end up in quasi concentration camps, they end up in a long period of time. And they never really, until the last few years, the French willing to sort of acknowledge this experience and how they treated it. It's a little bit different. The English had not done that. They had very strict lines between who was aided with the word and a colonialist. The French didn't think that way. And so the betrayal was much deeper in the sense.
Another one I referred to in the book, I got this a little bit skewed because I did read it several weeks ago, and since then but there was a reference to Gaston's father and his departure from the family and leaving them kind of bereft, and the fact that he had some scheme that ended up with, I guess, Sposito's Josephine using all of their money. And it never really, I was never clarified what that scheme was, but that was referred several times as kind of something that was embarrassing to the family, the fact that the father had just disappeared, left them with very little. After he resulted, or after what he did, resulted in the ruin of the parents. So I thought that was an interesting thing too. I would say shame, but certainly embarrassment.
Well, I'm going to skip a couple questions because David Cohen just brought up the Algerian form of colonialism. What did you think toward the end of the book of the aging Gaston's explanation of colonialism to Chloe? It was a scene where Denise and Gaston and Chloe were debating colonialism and in the context of Algeria. It struck me that Chloe was being quite idealistic, in condemning Gaston for a decision he didn't make. He was born in Algeria. And without justifying colonialism, Gaston contended that colonialism in America was different only because it was more successful. What did you think of that?
This gentleman looks like he has something to say, or is that a big chuckle?
Correct me if I'm wrong.
I mean, it's true. Just if you look at the numbers, the terrible
I maybe read this a little bit too simplistic. You know, to me, the biggest chasm with Gaston was that he was depressed. He was depressed all the time because he could not ever please his father. He could never please his mother-in-law, and he really couldn't please Barbara. And so,
Francois.
I'm talking about Francois. Oh yeah. He could not please his father. His mother-in-law definitely never. And Barbara was back and forth. She lived with him forever. I'm not sure how happy that marriage would have been. But you know, I was, frankly, there were chapters in this book where I was really depressed trying to read it.
Yeah, that's an interesting segue into another question that kept recurring to me, and Ginny and I discussed a lot, and that is about marriage. It seemed to be that the marriages were so central to this book, and the depictions of them, if you consider Gaston and Lucienne idealized, right? And did anyone notice that Lucienne never has a voice? She does not, and Gabriel, if you could go back to the previous slide, Lucienne is the only major character who never narrates any of the parts. Why is that? But how their marriage compared to that of Francois and Barbara?
There's no way they would have lived up to that.
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting. Lucienne is depicted in a very one-dimensional way. She's a saint. But she's only seen in the reflection of other characters' eyes. She seems like a nice enough person based on what everyone else saw. But she wasn't developed. And I don't know whether that was a deliberate decision by the author or not. What do you think?
I think along those lines, when I was reading this, and talked about this author being character-driven, but I felt let down by her character development. I was like, who are these people, really? We got inside Chloe's head a little bit, but then all of a sudden, finally at the end, Francois regretting and saying he felt all alone. I'm like, how'd you get here? What went on? And I felt a lot of that was left out, and the author disappointed me in getting inside these characters' heads, because just like you said, Jenny, it's like we knew them in the reflection of someone, but did we really know Lucienne? I mean, then never was it alluded to that she was Gaston's aunt? I mean, why didn't we get some feel inside their head, in my opinion?
Maybe that would have been more humanizing for her if we heard from her, and that wasn't the intent, right? She was held up as an idealized version of a spouse by Gaston, but perhaps because he was trying to reconcile the real feeling or the real situation, which was it was an incestuous relationship. But I did also think it was fascinating that there's no dialogue in this book, which I found that to make it very difficult to read for me, because I couldn't get an insight on the characters. It was just simply their reflections.
Yes, it seemed more like it really was Chloe telling her story. So she just saw Lucienne because she was so much older through the lens of hearing her father idealize. Because Lucienne was the one person who showed her father this unconditional love. So I just felt like we didn't see inside her head because Chloe didn't see inside her head. And it's very Chloe-centric, the whole story. And yet we don't really get to know Chloe that well, and I think that speaks to dissatisfaction. I felt the whole book that I wanted there to be more of a main character and more of a main character arc than there was. It's just too much. Yes, we're a little too removed from everyone.
Quick question. You all obviously have analyzed this book inside and out, and I wanted to know what either of you thought about the marriage between Barbara and Francois. I mean, did they just marry the wrong person, or was it more complicated than that? I couldn't figure out what really kept them together over the many pages of this book.
My impression was that Francois very deliberately married Barbara because she was an outsider, totally unrelated to France or Algeria or South America. He had kind of fallen in love with North America, particularly America, when he had an unfortunate year or so in school in France and felt rejected, we think, or bullied, perhaps, and took off to America, explored the Florida Keys, then decided, hey, this is where I'm going to settle. Let me marry this outsider, this Canadian. She disliked France just as he did. Now, they obviously did not have a very happy marriage through most of the book. She never really understood why he was such an Eeyore-type character. But he was very self-pitying, in my view, throughout the book. Never felt adequately loved or respected. Was not happy with his career choice. He was very uncomfortable with the fact that his marriage did not equal the idealized marriage of his sainted mother and his authoritarian father. So, I think that's why he married her. What's maybe more interesting is why did she marry him? Because her parents were really very outspoken in dissuading or trying to dissuade her. Question, is he completely white? I mean, that was kind of shocking when I read that, because presumably he was. But, but they dissuaded or tried and didn't really accept it.
And I thought Lenore, Barbara's mother, was an interesting character because in my mind, she played sort of a Greek chorus role. And she is one of the characters that evolves and grows in her thinking. I'm not sure that we got that from Chloe as much as we wanted it from Chloe. But Lenore, as Ginny so well said, did not want that marriage, was very dissatisfied and aggravated, very pushy as a mother-in-law. But at the end, she's reconciled with the family, and she's very much a part of it. And I thought that was interesting. What is the author trying to tell us with Lenore?
When I look at Francois, and you look at his exposure to women, his mother, Alysann, never said a word. She just smiled sweetly. So that was his exposure. He didn't have much exposure to his dad because he traveled all the time. And then his sister, Denise, is portrayed throughout the whole book as very weak, needy, unable to cope with life. So we sort of look at, went to America and he sees Barbara, who I think was sort of portrayed initially as pretty vibrant. So maybe that's why he went that way, because you look at the exposure to women prior to that, very, very different. So,
Great point.
It's ironic to me that Barbara seems to be happiest when she's studying law in Australia. But it didn't sound like she ever really had a career.
Yeah.
And Denise also was studying law, but she didn't really have a career either. She was, what a mess she was with her smoking and her.
Francois also went to law school.
Yeah.
But
No.
nobody ever practiced. So I'll chalk that up to good judgment.
I love the way she described Francois's kind of disastrous one-day trip to Cuba with no money. And what he really wanted was sex, and all he got was a cockfight. And he had to turn around and come home. And then the other trip that was wonderful to compare it with was with his trip with the kids and the mother-in-law, where they're really late and they go through a flash flood and they think they're going to die, and they have to go to this little motel with a cabin for the night venture. But it's a disaster, really.
Well, going back to the whole theme of this book, being told by Chloe, I believe that Claire, the author, is Chloe. And it's so obvious to me that she found the memoir of Gaston, her grandfather, and she has transcribed that and tried to fictionalize it and make it so everybody can understand her story. But I believe she pussyfooted with it, and she didn't develop it as she could have if she wasn't related to these people. I mean, if somebody who had found this memoir of the grandfather Gaston and said, oh, this would make a great story, but wasn't related, I think it would have been a much better book. It would have been more concise, just more pulled together, because as everybody's talking, I'm seeing that, yeah, there were so many threads left undone, and so many things that weren't talked about, and it should have been brought together better. So, and I don't think an editor could have even done it. I just think the author kind of failed in that. So.
Do you think that the author had the incestual relationship in her own family history? I'm curious about that. Or did she just add that in this fictionalized version for interest? We were talking about that just before everyone arrived.
She never said, the author never said whether that was from her own family.
We know that she had a family history of about 1,500 pages that was very similar, but she didn't clarify whether that was part of her family history.
I think she probably did have it in her family. I don't think it was that unusual at that time to have incestuous relationships and marriages. And so probably somewhere in there is that. I guess when I read the ending, that time, there was a lot of vagueness in the book, but I wasn't, that didn't influence my thinking as much as that ending. And the beginning and the ending, and that perfect marriage between Gaston and Lucienne. And there was a whole mystique to that. We really don't know why that marriage was perfect. We don't know anything about that couple, really. But what we do know is that they projected perfection to their kids. And those kids could never live up to that. It's an impossible thing. You learn that as you grow older and you have your own relationships, those relationships that look just so beautiful and so perfect, and everybody gets along so well, and everyone is so wealthy, and really when you go behind those doors, what is, is there really that perfection? So to me, this whole book was about this image of perfection that really doesn't exist. And it can really thwart people, as it did Francois. And to me, Barbara, her family was like so seemingly uncomplicated. She's the only child, and there's just a mother and a father in it, instead of all these generations of people. And it was a dream that, that marriage wasn't perfect, and probably Chloe's isn't either, or wasn't either. But, we all dream, I think, of that perfect marriage and that wonderful life. And you just have to grow old to realize, as Francois and Barbara did, that it's okay, because that's really what life is. So I guess I wasn't so bothered by the lack of dialogue and depth. It's kind of the whole idea of what really is life about.
I would think that you've got to assume that the author's intentions are what she actually did in the book. And she presented an interesting, very interesting family situation. But I think anything that she didn't do on purpose. And so the book is mostly about a number of people who are either inadequate or have difficulties, personal, and goes into interfamily relationships. And it made it very interesting. It didn't make it an easy book to read. It made it very interesting. But I really assume that she didn't develop a character. She didn't do that accidentally. And I heard her speak. I don't honestly remember what she said now about how autobiographical this book is. But I think she denied that it really was autobiographical. That it was about a family that experienced things that her family experienced. I really don't think that we can say there's a fault in what she didn't do, because I'm sure she did all of this intentionally.
She did absolutely deny that it was autobiographical. She said that her family history inspired her to write a story like this. So I don't think we can assume there was an incestuous relationship in her past. I think she was just telling a story. I think that part of Francois' problem was in his body. And I think we're talking around that and not talking about that. His alcohol ruined his relationship with his wife. It ruined his relationship with his children. And he could never find himself. And so he got caught in what he thought was a place where he was good. And he drank, and he would feel better. And he would feel important. But that was the only way he could do it. And I feel like that was a part of his life that this writer really wanted to drive home, that alcohol is not the answer. And I think it truly affected his family. But she denied it. Now, whether we want to go with that denial or not, she absolutely denied it was autobiographical. Just inspiration.
Thank you. Sharon. What about the... Oh, I'm
just going to ask, why did the library choose this book?
Why did we select this book? I can't recall.
I think we were attracted to it because it was reputedly a book about dislocation, political, geographical, ideological dislocation, which is a very topical issue these days.
I think, Jenny, you've answered it, because we struggled to figure out which book to read for this meeting, and we decided that something that was related to what's going on in the world without being specifically talking about Gaza and other places in Syria, that people that get displaced by wars, it changes their family dynamics forever. If they have to move down the street, if they move to another country, and this was kind of what the underlying theme of our decision was, as I recall.
And then we voted, I mean, that was demographic.
And it's gotten great reviews. I mean, she spoke at the literary festival, so she's, I think she primarily, correct me if I'm wrong, but she's a novelist, but she also writes poetry, am I right? Mm-hmm. And she has written other books based on the French-Algerian experience.
But as well as books that had nothing to do with these things, like the woman upstairs, the Emperor's Children. You know, I have not read either, but I've read about them. They don't seem very related to this book, so she's flexible.
I've read one of her other books. There is in that other book, and I read it a long time ago, I think it was The Emperor's Children, even though that's not what it's about, there is an unsettled feeling in that other, there's something unsettled about it.
She certainly focuses on characters and character development or lack of character development. I mean, I think to Silver's point, I think it's very deliberate that some characters are developed and we see an evolution and changes over the course of their lives. And others, we don't. I don't think that's an accident. I don't think it's an accident. Denise just kind of muddled along, through life and never really learned much from it would seem.
Never could commit either.
Yeah, she couldn't commit. There's a lot of questions about what was going on in her little head. There are references to a couple of affairs she had with men who were unavailable, marrying her boss. One that seemed to be really almost a fantasy love affair. There are also references to some special relationships with women and the possible suggestion that she was closeted but gay. I don't think the book ever resolves that question, but she was tormented in a lot of ways. Not so much about geography and dislocation, I don't think, but tormented in her personal life.
Pardon?
Except for the apartment she never lived in.
Yeah.
That was a lot.
Well, I think this is a great segue to the question that Ginny and I are dying to ask all of you, right?
Go for it.
Okay. So, there's no doubt this was a difficult book to read. I mean, I think we've all felt that. The narrative jumps around. There's a large cast of characters. There's a lot of stream of consciousness. And the pacing can be slow. So we're just dying to know, did you stick with it to the end? And would you recommend it? Please tell us. We've been wondering for months now.
I kind of wonder that, absent the Algerian-French slice of history, and the big reveal at the end, which I felt was almost like a cheap add-on, would we have cared about these characters? I thought they were a little whiny and dissatisfied. I don't know. I wanted just to get on with it. And, I mean, I realize there might have been some mental health issues, depression and all of that, but absent those two things, would this have been a good book?
I thought it was wonderfully written, and I have recommended it already to someone, but you have to be the kind of person who likes a slow book, and I like a slow book, so I enjoyed it. I didn't totally fulfill what I would have wanted it to, but I did think the writing was beautiful.
Yeah, I have a group of college friends, and we are always recommending books to each other, and I definitely would recommend this to my friends Caroli and Laura and Courtney, but probably not Ellen and Marnie. But I found it very compelling. I enjoyed it. Yeah, there were faults, but there are faults in every book that you can part in. Characters were kind of funny, but I just wanted to see what was going to happen, and it happens. Although it's a lot of background of the war, the dislocation and everything, but I just found it compelling to read. I also ultimately enjoyed this book. I usually read through a book in about a day and a half because they're written for quick reads. And I liked that this book made me stop, and I didn't feel like I had to stay up till 3 in the morning to finish it. I felt like I could read a few chapters and then put it down, come back the next day. So for me, that really worked. But I do not know if I would recommend it to most of the women in my book club because they're more into books that are 300 and some odd pages and that are easier to get through. But this writing was beautiful, and I really appreciated the author for that.
I agree with that. I think she was a wonderful writer. I think it was a difficult book to read, but I will go through most any book if I've started to get into the story. But it's certainly not a romance novel, and it was never intended to be, and I think it needs to be read as that. But this is a group of people who meet through their experiences, not she's telling them through their experiences. And in that sense, I think it's well written. And in that sense, I think it was a good book.
I did indeed finish it, and I do. Well, actually, I've changed. I've always felt like I had to finish every book I started, and I've gotten to that point where there are too many books and not enough hours in the day. So I have gotten to where I'm willing to, if something I start and I really don't like it at all, I don't get rid of it. It might sit back there in the back of the shelf, but I don't necessarily finish it. I really enjoyed it. I knew nothing about the French and Algeria. I mean, I didn't know about that. I know Susan and I have spent many hours talking about English colonialism, and I just didn't know much about that. So I enjoyed learning about that, and I'm fascinated with people who are uprooted and then have a difficulty in planting their roots elsewhere. And I think the world is full of those people, and I think it is harder for them. And I thought the characters were fascinating and typical. I mean, you had the sister who never does anything and is just a lump that you have to deal with. And I mean, most families have one of those. And then there's Francois, who can never please his father. I could never please my mother, so I really sympathize with that, you know. And they didn't have an ideal marriage, in my opinion, so that wasn't what I was looking for with my mother. But and poor Barbara. I don't know, I could see her too. She wanted to be the new modernist strong woman, but she couldn't quite pull that off. And she didn't really buy into, I don't think, Francois until the latter part of their lives. When their marriage was not toward its ends, but they were toward their ends. And then I think I suddenly felt sorry for her and realized that she hadn't treated him very well. And then, unfortunately, she forgot who he was. You know, because when he died, she did not know who he was.
But I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a lovely read. And I have to admit that the Literary Festival has done that for me, in that I have read books because I heard the author. And I have enjoyed them because of what that author brought to me before I opened the book. And that's why I read it to start with. I thought it was a very good family story, which we don't get as many of those as we used to.
I wanted to just say something about her writing style. You mentioned that it's a lot of stream of consciousness. Boy, can she pack it in. She would get more into it. I just looked randomly. I found an entire paragraph that was half a page that was one sentence. But it got so many points of view, what Barb was thinking of Francois. It was really a tour de force, and I found myself smiling when you get through one of those paragraphs and you'd say, wow, that was well done. And then there was one time when I laughed out loud, and I hope somebody else did, when Barbara was trying to fix the dinner for her in-laws. And she was trying to fix dinner for her in-laws, and the children were upstairs, and she needed to get them in the tub and out of the tub and into the bed, and then she had to do a 4-course meal because that was the French way. And she was, I don't know, fixing artichokes, and at the same time she was worried about the dessert. I just burst out laughing out loud. It was, and that's the only time I laughed.
I think no matter what we thought, and clearly there's some differing opinions, I think we would all say that it was a book that was ripe for discussion today. There are so many layers, and we could go on, but our time is up. So we want to thank you for being here today.